Hey guys, what's up? Thank you so much for clicking on this video. Today I'll be going over how I made Kratos' weaved leather shoulder armor. So if you'd like to see how I finished those, then please stay tuned. To start off, I went ahead and measured my shoulders, looked at the reference photos, and made sure I got measurements of where I wanted the pieces to be, and then I transferred them onto paper to make sure that I could get a mock-up of the different pieces that I wanted to use. Then I cut out all of the different pieces so that I could lay them out across my shoulder and on top of one another to make sure that the size differences were correct based on the reference images. Next, I laid my pattern pieces onto 2mm high density EVA foam from SKS Props, making sure to lay down the edges, of course. And I went ahead and pinned the pieces down to make sure they wouldn't move around as I was tracing them onto the foam with Sharpie. This was a little fiddly because the paper is pretty thin, but you know, just to get the rough shape out. You could also just transfer your measurements onto the foam as well. I then labeled the pieces so I wouldn't lose track and cut them out of the foam. I then laid these foam pieces out on my pleather, and I went ahead and marked about an inch out from each of the corners. I did this because I wanted the pleather to wrap around the back edge of each of the foam pieces. I went ahead and labeled each piece so I wouldn't get lost, and then I made sure to connect the lines on each edge so that I had a straight edge to wrap around the back pieces of the foam. In order to get an accurate cutout for the middle where the weaving would be viewed through, I traced around each piece of foam so that I would get exactly where the fold lines would be for around the back. Then I made a mark 1 inch in from each of these fold lines. This is where I'm going to cut out the fabric, and I made sure to do 1 inch in because I wanted about an inch of coverage over the weaved spots on the top pieces of the foam. You'll see how this all comes together later, so apologies if my explanation is a little confusing, but I promise it'll make sense later. After I made my markings, I used my ruler to connect them with a straight line, and these will be the lines that I will cut along to get the window. I then cut each piece out, making sure my cuts saved as much fabric as possible. To get a clean cut line along the lines that I made in the middle, you can fold the fabric along the line and then take your scissors to cut just straight down so that you get a straight cut on the line. This means that you don't waste any fabric and can use the scraps for the weaving. I decided I want my weaving strips to be 3/4 of an inch, so I measured these on the scrap pieces and cut them out. I then took the base layer of foam for any of the pieces, and I laid the leather covering over the top of them. This was to give me an idea of where the window would be. I then laid the strips over this to make sure that they were long enough to not be seen once I glued the pleather window on top of them. Ta-da! Next I got a piece of cardboard and I traced the opening onto it. I planned to weave my pieces onto this piece of cardboard, and I needed to make sure that none of the ends of the strips would be visible through the window of the final product. I laid my strips out exactly how I laid them onto the foam, and I pinned down one side of them. This is to allow me to lift them up to make the weaving process much easier. Now let's get weaving. Take one of your strips and decide if you want it to be laid over or under the other one. I decided to start this one under. Now the next part is going to be opposite of what I just did, so it's going to be over that strip. The next one will be under, so lift your strip up and drop that one. Boom, now it's underneath. And then I went ahead and pinned each of these strips in place so that I could keep lifting them without worrying about it sliding all over. Now we just went over, so we're gonna go under this one. And you just keep going over, under, over, under. Don't worry if you have to pull the pins out to make it easier to do one step of the weaving. You can just go ahead and pin it back in place once you have that piece where you like it. And there you have it, one strip weaved. Now let's get to the next one. Now with our second strip, we're just going to do everything backwards to the first one that we did. So because the first one went under, we're going to put this one over. See? Now you can go ahead and pin that strip in place and go ahead with your weaving. That one went over, so this one will go under. Over, under, just opposite to whatever you did the first time. Now your third strip will be opposite to the one you just did and will be the same as the first strip that you did. So this one, because the second one went over and the first one went under, this one will be under. It may look difficult, and I hope my instructions make sense, but this is actually very simple once you get started. After you do the first two, everything else becomes pretty natural and you can see exactly which pattern you're supposed to follow for each strip. In case you need to see it a little bit more, and just because completion porn is always satisfying to watch, I'll go ahead and leave the rest of the footage in here now. Boom shaka, we made it! Look at this beauty. Woven pleather. Looks pretty great, don't you think? In order to keep all that work we just did together, I'm going to take some EAT 6000 and put it into a precision craft syringe and go ahead and glue each crossover together. Yes, every single place where there is a crossover I'm gonna glue together, but I skipped most of the footage because it's super boring to watch. Ta-da! Now let it dry for 24 hours at least. After it's dry, you can go ahead and remove all of the pins from the cardboard. And you can observe your beautiful masterpiece. Wowee, look at it, so beautiful, super flexible, and all those weaves still stayed together. Yahoo! Now it's time to assemble. I took my weaving and I laid it over my foam backing. Then I took the covering pleather piece and laid it on top to make sure that the weaving was exactly where I wanted it to be and that none of the unwoven sections would be visible through the window. Next, I glued down my pleather pieces to my foam backing. I used hot glue, but contact cement's a probably better option. I just don't feel comfortable using it in my house, and I didn't want to go outside because winter in New York is very cold. After I glued it down, I trimmed off the excess pieces from the weaving to make sure that I could get a nice fold on the covering, and also just to make sure that the finished product was a little bit cleaner. Be careful that you don't cut too much off, because then you'll see naked foam through the window and destroy all the hard work you just did in weaving. To put the cover onto the foam backing, I made sure that the corners were all lined up exactly where I'd measured them before, and I glued the flaps down to the back of the foam. The front of Kratos' armor has a stitching detail, And in order to achieve this, I cut little notches into the front of the covering so that I could fold down and get a nice seam allowance or hem on the front. Then I took a large hand sewing needle and some thick white cord, and I went ahead and started hand stitching. This can get a little difficult as you're going through potentially 2 layers of pleather and a layer of foam, but I used my pin box to help me push the needle through, and then I used some pliers to help pull them through on the back side. I'm sure there's better ways to do this, but this is what I had on hand, and in order to not kill my fingers, this was the best solution for me. This is the most basic form of hand sewing. It's called a running stitch. I'm not going to go into too much detail about exactly how you do it, but if you'd like to see more tutorials, there's a ton of hand sewing tutorials on YouTube. I just kept going with my running stitch until I made it all around the perimeter of the covering. And here's the finished product! I'm so excited. I think it looks really good, and I think it also looks pretty close to the reference image. The next step is going to be weathering these, and I really can't wait to make them look all gross and beat up. I, of course, will be filming all the steps in my Kratos series. So until then, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!